The morning Corden Marsh counted his cattle. For the third time, the number did not change, 14. He stood at the edge of the south pasture in the gray March light of 1883, his breath making small clouds in the cold Colorado air. And he counted again, the way a man does when he already knows the answer but cannot bring himself to accept it. 14 animals where there should have been 45. 14 animals on land that his Uncle Eben had built from nothing, from 6 head and a promise, and 20 years of work that had left calluses on his hands, thick as boot leather. Corden was 38 years old. He had the kind of face that had been in the sun long enough that the lines around his eyes had become part of him, not signs of age, but signs of attention. The permanent record of a man who had spent years looking at distances and weather and the slow language of land. His shoulders were broad from labor that was real, not performed. His boots were worn at the heel, but clean. He had learned that from Eben. Whatever else goes wrong, keep your boots clean. It was the kind of lesson that meant more than boots. He stood in the pasture and counted 14 cattle and did not say a word. The land office letter had come 3 weeks earlier. Formal language, careful phrasing, the tone of men who delivered bad news for a living and had learned to sand the edges down. The Marsh property at Copper Ridge, Colorado Territory was approaching the threshold for loan review. An agricultural consultant would be dispatched to assess the property's viability and current operational condition. The assessment would determine whether the operating loan would be extended, restructured, or called. What the letter meant underneath the careful language was, "This proved the land is worth saving or lose it." Corden had read the letter twice, folded it, and put it in his coat pocket. Then he had gone out to count the cattle. That had been 3 weeks ago. The number had been 17 then. It was 14 now. He turned and walked back toward the barn. The wagon from Copper Ridge arrived 2 hours later. He heard it before he saw it, the sound of iron wheels on the frozen ruts of the access road, carrying a long way in the thin morning air. He came out of the barn with a bridle in his hands that he had been mending for the better part of an hour without actually making progress on it, and he stood in the yard and watched the wagon come. It stopped. The driver, an older man named Hector Blythe, who ran the freight route between Copper Ridge and the outlying ranches, set the brake and climbed down. He nodded at Corden in the way of a man delivering something he was not sure would be welcome. The woman who stepped down from the wagon did not wait for help. She was 27 years old, and she was large in the way that some women are large solidly and without apology, the kind of build that spoke of physical presence rather than excess. She wore a dark coat that had seen considerable weather, practical boots, and she carried a leather-bound ledger under her arm the way another woman might carry a Bible. She did not look around at the mountains, or the morning light, or any of the things that visitors to Colorado Territory usually found worth commenting on. She looked at the fence line. Specifically, she looked at the east fence. "Your east fence has been open for at least 4 months," she said. "That is where your cattle went." Corden looked at her. She was not looking at him. She was still looking at the fence, her head slightly tilted the way a person looks at something they are measuring, rather than merely seeing. "Willa Pruitt," she said, "agricultural consultant, Copper Ridge Land Office." "Corden Marsh." She looked at him then. Direct, unhurried, the assessment of someone who had learned to read a situation quickly and accurately and had no interest in pretending otherwise. Then she looked back at the fence. "When did you last ride the east boundary?" He thought about it honestly. 6 weeks ago. "That is why you stopped finding breaks," she said, "and why animals have been walking through. Your visible count is 14. Your recorded count is 45. Most of the difference is likely drift rather than mortality if the fence pattern holds." She said it the way a doctor states a diagnosis, not unkindly, not kindly either, simply as a fact that existed whether it was comfortable or not. Corden looked at the east fence. He had known it was bad. He had stopped riding it because every time he did, he found something else that needed money he did not have, and time he could not stretch further. It had seemed in the accounting of a man managing too many problems with too few resources, like the least urgent thing. He could see now in the way she had seen it in 30 seconds from a wagon that this had been wrong. "Show me the south pasture," she said. He showed her. She walked the pasture with her ledger open, making marks in a small, precise hand, not talking, not explaining. He walked beside her and did not talk either because she was not asking him to. She stopped at intervals. She crouched and looked at the grass, close up, pulling a few blades and examining them in a way he had never seen anyone examine grass before, as though the grass had something specific to say, and she was listening for it. At the third stop, she stood and looked out over the pasture. "How long have you been running this pasture continuous?" "It has always been the south pasture." "That is not what I asked." He pushed his hat back. He had taken the ranch from Eben in October of 1881. Before that, Eben had run it for nearly a decade. 9-10 years, since my uncle had it. She made a note. "The soil is exhausted," she said. "You have been pulling grass from the same ground for nearly a decade with no rotation, no rest period. The root systems are compromised. Your cattle look thin even when you are feeding them because the nutritional value of what they are grazing is a fraction of what it should be." She paused. "You have been feeding them the idea of grass rather than grass." He looked at the pasture. It looked like grass to him, but he had stopped trusting his own eyes about this place some time ago. "The men at the feed store told me I was overgrazing," he said. "You were. I thought they were trying to sell me more product. They were all so right." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. The sound a man makes when he learns that a warning he dismissed because of its source turned out to be accurate. "So I have been running the herd into the ground for 9 years without knowing it." "The land has been trying to tell you for 9 years," she said. "Nobody listened." She closed the ledger. "That changes today." They walked the fence lines next. The north fence first, which was bad, then the south, which was worse, then the beginning of the east, which was where she stopped and made 4 marks in the ledger without commentary. He watched her work and thought about the letter from the land office and about Eben and about the quality of silence that had settled over this ranch in the 18 months since things had started going wrong in ways he could not explain or account for, no matter how carefully he reviewed each decision he had made. He had worked himself to the edge of what a man could do. Early mornings, late nights, every season producing a new problem, every solution arriving too late or costing too much. He had borrowed from the land office at terms that seemed reasonable, and then tightened. He had borrowed from a private creditor named Aldous Greer at terms that seemed generous, and which he had come to regard sideways in recent months, though he could not have said precisely why. Something in the ease of it, something in the patience. He had done everything he knew how to do, and the ranch had continued to decline. Standing in the March cold, watching this woman mark up her ledger, Corden felt something he had not allowed himself in a long time. Not hope exactly. Something colder and more useful than hope. The sensation a man gets when he has been trying to fix something in the dark and someone finally brings a lamp. "I need to see your full records," she said. "The actual ledger, not the summary you submitted to the land office." He stopped walking. She looked at him with an expression that was not accusatory. Patient, rather. The look of someone who has had this conversation before and understands what it means when a man goes still at that particular request. "The full ledger," she said again. "I know there is one. The numbers in the summary do not reconcile. There are expenses missing. I am not interested in why they are missing. I need the complete picture." A long pause. Wind moved through the dry grass. Somewhere in the south pasture, one of the 14 cattle made a sound that carried a long way in the quiet. "It is in the barn," Corden said. "Top shelf, behind the harness oil." She nodded and wrote it down. That evening, she spread her notes across the kitchen table and worked without stopping while he did the night check on the cattle. When he came back in, the lamp was burning low, and she was still at it. He made coffee without asking if she wanted any, and set a cup beside her notes without disturbing a single paper, and sat down across from her with his own. They sat without speaking for a while. Outside, the Colorado night pressed in cold and complete. 3 of the cattle in the south pasture. she said, not looking up. The ones moving with that slight shift in their hind legs. I want to separate them tomorrow and assess individually. All right. And I need to look at your water source. He looked at his coffee cup. East Fork Creek, same source my uncle used. When did you switch to it? He thought. Spring of '82. Fellow came by, said the North Spring was likely going dry, said there had been a geological report, recommended the creek as the more reliable source. He paused. Man named Rufus Crane. He worked for Greer now and then, did odd jobs around the county. Something shifted in her expression, small and controlled. She wrote something down. Did you verify the geological report? No. He stopped. I had no reason to think you trusted the man who told you. He had been around, seemed like he knew the land. She set her pen down and looked at him directly. The East Fork Creek has had elevated sulfate levels since a shelf collapse upstream in the spring of 1881. Not enough to kill cattle outright. Enough to suppress appetite and compromise gut function over time. She held his gaze. Your animals have not been thriving because they cannot. The water they are drinking has been working against everything else you are trying to do for 2 years. Corden sat with this. 2 years. He had been watering his cattle from a bad source for 2 years, watching them decline, attributing it to everything he could think of. The grass, the bloodlines, his own management, himself. Is the North Spring still active? He said. I would need to check, but if it is... It is, he said slowly. Far as I know, I have not ridden up there in a long time. Then that is our first project, she said. Tomorrow morning. He looked at her across the table. This woman with her ledger and her precise handwriting and her way of saying what was true without dressing it up. He thought about what it would have meant to have someone like this here a year ago. 2 years ago. When Crane came by with his report about the North Spring. You figure most of this out before you got here, he said. Most of it. The reports were enough to see the pattern. I needed to be here to confirm it. She picked up her pen. And to find what the reports did not show. What is that? She looked at him steadily. That this is not a failing ranch, she said. It is a ranch that has been failed. There is a difference, and I intend to document it. He did not know exactly what she meant by that. Not yet. But he felt the weight of it settling the way you feel the shape of a thing before you can name it. He went to bed that night for the first time in 18 months without the heaviness of a man who has accepted defeat and is simply waiting for the paperwork. The next morning came cold and clear, the Colorado sky, that hard deep blue, that looked like it had been cut from something more permanent than weather. They were in the yard before the light was fully up. She had her ledger. He had 2 pickaxes and a level she had produced from her bag, which told him she had known before she arrived that this kind of work would need doing. The North Spring was 4 miles up the ridge. He had ridden past it 100 times in the last 18 months without stopping. She tasted the water when they got there. Crouched at the edge of the spring, cupped her hand, drank a small amount and spat it onto the frozen ground beside her. He watched her do it without comment. Clean, she said. No sulfate. This is what your cattle should be drinking. He crouched beside her and cupped his hand and drank. Cold and clean and tasting of nothing but itself. He had forgotten that water could taste like nothing but water. They trenched by hand all morning and into the afternoon. He swung the pickaxe into frozen ground that did not give easily and did not apologize for it. She walked the line with the level because water moved by gravity and the angle of a pipe determined whether it moved at all, and she had known this before she arrived. Around midday, when the cold had backed off enough to make the work merely hard rather than brutal, he said, Where did you learn all of this? My father, she said, tamping down the trench wall with efficient movements. He was a livestock assessor for the state of Kansas for 20 years. I went with him on most of his work, sat in the wagon and watched him walk other people's land and tell them things they did not want to hear. Must have been an education. I did not know it was unusual until later. At the time, it just seemed like the world had a shape that you either learned to see or you did not. He swung the pickaxe. And your father, he still work. A pause. She kept tamping. He had a small farm outside Wichita. Spent 20 years telling other men how to fix their land and never once applied it to his own. Her voice was even. The voice of someone who has made peace with something painful by looking at it plainly for long enough. He lost it when I was 19. Bank took it in March. He was gone by June. The pickaxe stayed still for a moment. I am sorry, he said. Do not be. Be grateful. She looked at him. I watched my father die knowing he knew better and chose not to act. And I promised myself I would never be in a position where I knew better and did not. She turned back to the trench. That is why I am here, Mr. Marsh. Not because the land office sent me, because I cannot watch something die when the information to save it is sitting right there. He looked at her for a moment. Then he lifted the pickaxe and swung again. They finished the trench line by 4 in the afternoon. He rigged the pipe himself, his hands knowing the work, even when everything else had been uncertain for a long time. She told him the angle, and he cut the connections fast and clean. When the water ran, it ran clear. The first 2 cattle at the north end of the south pasture found the new trough before dark. They drank long and slow, their sides moving in the rhythm of animals, taking in something their bodies had been needing for a long time. Cordon watched them and felt something he did not usually allow himself. Not the relief of a problem solved. Something quieter than that. The feeling of watching something live that he had been afraid was past living. They know, he said quietly. Animals always know, she said beside him. They just cannot tell you in a language you understand. The next morning she brought the full ledger to the kitchen table and worked for 2 hours before he was up. When he came in from the early check, she had 4 pages of her notebook filled with figures, cross-references, and a column of numbers she had circled 3 times. He looked at her face when he came through the door and stopped walking. Sit down, she said. He sat. She turned the ledger around and put her finger on the cattle purchase records from the years since he had taken ownership. He looked at the columns, leaned in, looked longer. I bought mostly young stock, he said slowly, trying to build the herd without overextending. You bought young stock from the same 2 suppliers, she said, both out of Las Animas County. She slid her notebook across. Those are your mortality rates cross-referenced against purchase origin. Your cattle from Las Animas County die at nearly 3 times the rate of the animals you bought at the Pueblo Stockyard Fair. He stared at the numbers. It means you have been buying compromised bloodlines for 4 years, she said. The Las Animas suppliers are moving cattle they cannot bring to full market weight. Animals with constitutions that cannot hold up under normal range conditions. You put those animals on already depleted land, watering them from a contaminated source, and what you get is exactly what you have. She was quiet for a moment. A herd that shrinks regardless of how hard you work. Cordon sat back in his chair. The sound he made was not anger, and it was not grief. It was something older and heavier than both. The sound of a man who has just understood the full shape of something he has been living inside without being able to see it. 4 years of buying animals designed to fail from suppliers someone had pointed him toward, with money borrowed from a man whose patience had always seemed in retrospect a little too easy. Who introduced you to the Las Animas suppliers? She said. He already knew the answer. He had known it for the last several seconds. Aldous Greer, he said. She did not say anything. She did not need to. He told me they were reliable, Cordon said. Said he had dealt with them for years, said they were good bloodlines at a fair price. He pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at them. I trusted him. I know. He holds the secondary lien on this property. I know that too. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, wind moved through the dry grass of the south pasture, which was still depleted but slightly less so than it had been 3 days ago, which would be less so again in 3 months if the rotation held. So the land was not the only problem, he said. "The land, the water, and the bloodlines," she said. 3 compounding failures. Any one of them alone you might have survived. All 3 together managed by a man working as hard as you have been working." She paused. "This is not a natural result, Mr. Marsh. It is a calculated one." He looked at her. "What I am telling you," she said carefully, "is that this ranch has been sabotaged by bad information and bad guidance from a man with a financial interest in its failure. And I am going to document every piece of it." He sat with the word sabotaged for a long time. He had thought in terms of bad luck, bad seasons, his own insufficiency. It had not occurred to him to think in terms of design. But sitting at that table with the ledger open and the numbers in front of him and the memory of Rufus Crane's easy certainty about the North Spring, it occurred to him now. "There is something else," she said. She pointed to an entry in the ledger, a payment from August of 1881, $340. He looked at the amount and then at the handwriting. "That is not my hand," he said. "No." He looked at it more carefully, the particular slant of the letters. He had seen that handwriting in the old correspondence his uncle kept in the tin box under the bed. "That is Eben's writing," he said. "Your uncle paid $340 in August of 1881 to a survey company out of Pueblo," she said. "Your uncle died in September of 1881. You inherited the property in October of 1881. She held his gaze. "There is no survey documentation anywhere in the ranch records. No maps, no report, no record of what they found or what they were looking for." He stared at the entry. $340 is not standard for a boundary survey in this county," she said. "Standard runs $50 to $80 depending on acreage. Someone paid 4 times the standard rate to survey this land 1 month before your uncle died and 1 month before you inherited it." Corden was very still. "Do you know anyone who was close to Eben in the last months of his life?" she said. "Someone who might know what prompted that survey?" "Calder Voss," he said. "Old man lives east of town. He and Eben went back a long way." She wrote the name down. "Can you reach him?" "I can ride out tomorrow." "Then do that," she said. "We meet with Greer on Saturday. We go with whatever Calder Voss can tell us." He stood. The day was pressing in through the kitchen window, bright and cold. But he stood at the table for a moment, looking at the ledger, at the entry in his uncle's handwriting, at the circled column of numbers that told the story of 4 years of losses that should not have been inevitable. He had come out here in the fall of 1881 with nothing but the inheritance of a man who believed in him and the intention to justify that belief. He had worked every day since. He had watched the ranch decline by degrees he could not explain, and he had blamed himself, for each one had added them up into a verdict against his own capability, had carried that verdict like a stone in his chest for going on 2 years. The stone was still there, but it had changed shape. That afternoon they separated the 3 cattle with the compromised gait. She moved through the pasture with a deliberateness that surprised him, reading each animal's body language before she approached, never startling, never forcing. He watched from the fence and did not offer to help because she had not asked. When she had all 3 in the smaller pen, she had him hold each animal in turn, not because she could not manage it, because she wanted him to feel what she was feeling. "Feel the difference," she said when he had his hand along the middle animal's ribs. "She is too light. Too light, and her gut is off. Feel how she holds her back legs, that slight shift to the left." He felt it, the small, persistent adjustment of an animal compensating for something it could not name. "That is gut pain," she said. "Low grade, but chronic. She has been uncomfortable for months. She is spending energy managing pain instead of building weight. That is why her feed conversion is poor." She stepped back. "Clean water and reduced competition at the trough. 2 weeks, maybe 3. I expect she will recover. And if she does not," she looked at him directly, "then she does not. But we give her every chance before we make that call." He nodded. His jaw was tight. "You care about them," she said. "They are my responsibility." "That is not the same thing," she said. "A lot of men treat cattle like entries in a column. You treat them like something that deserves to be well." She stepped back from the pen. "Do not lose that. Just learn to pair it with better information. The evening brought a letter from Aldous Greer. It arrived with Hector Blythe, who handed it over with the expression of a man completing a transaction he had not designed and did not enjoy. Greer had heard that a woman assessor had arrived at the Marsh property. He did not believe an agricultural assessment conducted by a female consultant would satisfy the terms of the operating agreement with the land office. He intended to raise the question with the regional supervisor before the Saturday meeting. He recommended Corden seek a qualified replacement before the review period expired. Corden read it twice, then he folded it and set it down. "Greer," he said. She looked up. He pushed the letter across. She read it without expression and set it down. "He came early," she said. "He did not wait for Saturday." "He is not afraid of Saturday," she said. "He is afraid of what we will have by Saturday." She looked at the letter again. "He does not know about the ledger entry. He does not know about Calder Voss. He knows I have been here 4 days, and he has decided that is long enough to be concerned." Corden looked at her. "Can he do it? Get you removed? He can raise noise. Whether that noise becomes action depends on the land office." She paused. "Which is why tomorrow matters. Ride to Voss in the morning. Whatever he knows, we need it before Saturday." Corden picked up the letter and set it on the table in the way of a man putting something down that he intends to deal with properly and not before. Outside, the Colorado night had come down off the mountains, complete and cold and indifferent to the problems of the men and women who lived at its feet. The south pasture was dark. The north trough was full of clean water. 3 cattle in a small separate pen were drinking better than they had in months. 14 animals that morning. 19 now. He had found the other 5 on the east boundary in the afternoon, exactly where Willer's fence analysis said they would be. 5 animals with his uncle's brand still readable on 2 of them, thin and wary, but alive. He had brought them through the gap the same way he always brought animals in, with patience and a low voice and no sudden angles. When the last one stepped back onto marshland, he had stood with his hand on the fence post for a moment and not said anything to anyone. 19. It was not 45. But it was more than 14, and it was moving in a direction that had not been available to him 4 days ago, and Corden Marsh understood that the direction of a thing matters as much as its position. He went to bed that night with the letter from Greer on the kitchen table and the question of Calder Voss ahead of him in the morning, and the knowledge, new and still unfamiliar, that the trouble he had been living inside of had a shape, and that knowing the shape was the beginning of being able to fight it. Corden rode out before first light. He had not slept well, which was nothing new, but the quality of his wakefulness had changed. For 18 months, the sleepless hours had been filled with the running subtraction of a failing operation, the slow erosion of a man who keeps working because stopping feels like dying. Last night, his mind had been running forward instead of backward, turning over the entry in Eben's handwriting, the $340, the survey company that had taken the money, and left no record of it found. He saddled up in the dark and rode east toward Calder Voss. The morning came up slowly over the eastern plains, the sky going from black to deep blue, to the pale gray that preceded color, and Corden rode through it with his collar up and his mind working. He thought about Aldous Greer. He had known Greer for going on 4 years since the first winter after he took the ranch, when the land office loan had seemed insufficient and Greer had appeared with an offer that seemed at the time genuinely generous. Secondary lien at reasonable terms, patient timeline, the manner of a man doing a neighbor a good turn. Corden had signed. He thought about that signature now riding through the gray Colorado morning and tried to remember what had made it feel right. Greer had been present. Greer had known things about the land, about the county, about the cattle market. He had offered the names of suppliers. He had sent Rufus Crane out the following spring with a report about North Spring going dry. He had attended every land office meeting with the calm of a man who had nothing to worry about because he did not expect anything to go wrong. A patient man. Corden rode and thought about patience and what it looked like when it was being used as a weapon. Calder Voss lived in a stone house east of Copper Ridge that looked like it had been built to outlast everything around it, which it probably had. The man himself was somewhere around 70, with the sharp eyes of someone who had survived a long time by watching carefully and speaking only when the words were worth the breath. He was already up when Corden arrived, had coffee on, poured a cup without being asked, and set it on the table and sat down across from Corden with the stillness of a man who had been expecting this conversation for some time and was simply waiting to see how it arrived. Corden told him about the ledger entry, the $340, the survey company from Pueblo, the August date, the missing documentation. Calder listened without interrupting. When Corden finished, the old man sat for a long time with his hands around his coffee cup and looked at the table between them. Then he said, "Your uncle did not commission that survey." The kitchen was very quiet. "Greer did," Calder said. Corden set his cup down carefully. Calder told it straight, the way old men tell things they have held for a long time without unnecessary decoration. In July of 1881, a man had come to the Marsh Ranch representing himself as an agent for a railroad company with interest in acquiring land along the Copper Ridge corridor. Eben had been sick by then, not bedridden, but diminished the illness, taking the edges off his sharpness in ways that came and went. The man had explained that a survey was required to assess the property's value for potential acquisition. Railroad business, standard procedure. He had brought paperwork that looked official and used language that sounded reasonable, and Eben, who was 63 years old and sick and perhaps more tired than he let anyone see, had signed the disbursement and paid $340 from the ranch account. The survey results had never come. Eben had asked about them twice in August. Both times he was told the results were pending, that these things took time, that he would have the documentation before winter. He died in September without seeing a single page. 2 months before that man came to Eben. Calder said, Aldous Greer came to the ranch himself, offered to buy the property, named a price. He paused. Your uncle refused. Said he had promised the land to you, said he believed you would make something of it. Corden was very still. Eben told me that directly, Calder said. More than once in those last months. He talked about you, about leaving the land to someone who would work it right, who had the character for it. The old man looked at him steadily across the table. He did not doubt you, son. Not for a single day that I saw. Outside, the morning had fully arrived, pale winter sunlight coming through the stone house windows and laying itself in long rectangles across the floor. Corden looked at the light and thought about his uncle, who had died in September of 1881, with the survey results still pending and the ranch promised to a nephew he believed in, and who had been maneuvered by a sick man's trust and a stranger's paperwork into paying for something he never received, the results of which had gone to the man who had already tried to buy the land and been refused. The survey company, Corden said. Do you know anything about it? I looked into it afterward, Calder said. When things started going wrong for you, and I started wondering. He got up, went to a cabinet in the corner, came back with a folded piece of paper. The company was incorporated in Pueblo in the spring of 1880. It dissolved 6 weeks after Eben died. He set the paper on the table. I wrote to the county clerk down there. Asked about the founding documents. They told me there was a silent partner listed, 40% stake. Name buried 2 levels deep in the corporate structure. He looked at Corden. I could not get the name myself, but I wrote down the structure and the date and the clerk's name in case someone with more standing than an old man writing letters could follow it further. Corden picked up the paper, read it, folded it, and put it in his coat pocket. There is one more thing, Calder said. He rose again and went to a different cabinet lower down and came back with an envelope. Old. The paper gone soft with years of being handled and then put away and handled again. He set it on the table between them. Eben wrote this 6 days before he died, Calder said. He gave it to me. Said if anything ever came of his feelings about what had happened, somebody ought to have it. He paused. I sent it to the ranch 2 winters ago. Put it in the tin box on your porch myself the winter of 81, going into 82 just after you had settled in. He looked at Corden. I did not know if you had ever found it. Corden looked at the envelope. His uncle's handwriting on the front. No name, no address, written to no one in particular, which meant it had been written to clarify thought rather than to send. The kind of letter a man writes when he needs to put the shape of something into words before the words become unavailable to him. He picked it up. "Read it here if you want," Calder said, "or take it with you." Corden took it with him. He read it on horseback, stopped in the middle of a long, flat stretch of Colorado winterland, with nothing around him but the cold and the sound of his horse breathing. He read it twice. His uncle's handwriting was careful. Even at the end, the letters formed with the deliberateness of a man who had not had much formal education and had therefore always taken writing seriously. Eben did not name anyone. He had not been certain enough of names to write them down, or perhaps he had been too careful to accuse without proof. But he described a feeling. The unease of a man who had looked at the shape of his circumstances and understood that the shape was not natural, that someone had been patient, that something had been arranged around him while he was occupied with being sick and trying not to show it. He wrote that he was not afraid for himself. He wrote that he was afraid for the land. And he wrote near the end in language that was simple and direct, in the way of a man who had run out of time for anything else that he hoped whoever held the land after him would be the kind of person who did not give up on it because the land deserved someone who would look at it clearly and tell it the truth. Corden sat on horseback in the Colorado winter and read those words and did not look at anything for a long while. He had spent 2 years carrying a verdict against himself. 2 years of believing that the failure was his, that Eben had left him something he was not adequate to hold, that the slow collapse of everything he worked for was the natural result of his own insufficiency. He had gotten up every morning and worked anyway, not because he believed it would change anything, but because stopping felt like proving something about himself that he was not ready to accept. And here was his uncle's handwriting 6 days before death saying, "I believe in you. I always believed in you. Something was arranged around me, and I felt it, and I want you to know that what you will find, when you look clearly, is not your failure." He folded the letter and put it in his coat beside Calder's paper and rode back to the ranch. Willa was in the barn when he arrived, doing the individual assessments on the 3 separated cattle. He tied his horse and came to the barn door, and she looked up, once read his face, and went back to the animal she was examining. He waited until she had finished with the 3rd one. Then he went in and told her everything. Straight through in order the way she had shown him in 4 days to present information. Facts first. Interpretation after. She listened without interrupting. Made 2 notes in her ledger. When he finished, she was quiet. Then she said, "The corporate structure Calder documented. If Greer's name is in those Pueblo Incorporation records, it connects him directly to the survey. It connects him to a survey conducted under false pretenses on land he had already tried to purchase and been refused," she said, "which connects the survey results to his decision to extend you credit." She looked at her notes. A man who knows the precise geological and water rights value of a piece of land, who obtained that knowledge through fraud, and who then positions himself as a creditor on that land at terms designed to result in eventual foreclosure. She paused. That is not opportunism. That is construction. Corden spread his uncle's letter on the workbench beside the store. She read it, stood very still while she read it. Set it down with care. "He knew something was wrong," Corden said. "He felt the shape of it," she said. "He did not have the evidence, but he felt it." She looked at the letter for a moment longer. This letter, read in a courtroom, combined with the incorporation records and testimony about the North Spring. She stopped. "We need an attorney, Corden, before Saturday." "Harwick Dunn," he said. "He does land titles and estate work mostly, but he is the man in Copper Ridge." "Ride to him tomorrow morning," she said. "Do not tell him everything. Tell him you have evidence of irregularities in the secondary lien agreement and potential fraud in its commission. Ask him whether that constitutes grounds for legal challenge. See what he says when he only has half the picture." She picked up her ledger and went back to work. He stood in the barn for a moment after she turned away, holding the paper Calder had given him, thinking about his uncle paying $340 to a company that had been built specifically to take his money and give his land's secrets to a man who wanted to own it. Eben had trusted the wrong people because he was sick and tired and had not known there was reason not to. Corden had trusted the wrong people because he was new to the land and working hard and had not known there was reason not to. The difference between them was that Corden was still standing. He intended to stay that way. The next day he rode to town and found Harwick Dunn in his office above the feed store on Copper Ridge's main street, a small, careful man with the stillness of someone who had spent 30 years listening to people tell him their worst situations and had learned that the listening was most of the work. Corden laid out what Willa had told him to lay out. The lien agreement's unusual terms, the entry in Eben's ledger, the survey company that had dissolved 6 weeks after his uncle died, the corporate structure document Calder had obtained. Dunn read the documents without speaking. He read them in the order Corden presented them and then read 2 of them again. Then he set them down and looked at Corden. "Where did you find all of this? My ranch, tin box, and a ledger I stopped looking at. Who organized it? Woman from the land office. Agricultural consultant." Dunn looked at the corporate structure document again. "The name of the silent partner in this company. You do not have it." "Not yet, but the clerk in Pueblo knows the structure. Someone with standing to make a formal request could get the full founding documents." Dunn made a note. "Do that today. I know the right person to ask." He looked at the ledger entry. "Survey company in Pueblo closed 6 weeks after the landowner died." He set it down. "If Greer's name appears in those records, it connects him to the fraud directly. It gives us grounds for a legal challenge to the lien," Dunn said carefully. "I will not call it fraud until I have more than what is in front of me. But what you have brought me today is a reasonable foundation for a claim that the secondary lien was obtained through misrepresentation and conflict of interest." He looked at Corden directly. "That is not nothing, Mr. Marsh." Something shifted in Corden's chest, something that had been braced against weight for a long time. "What does that mean practically?" he said. "It means I file a motion with the county court to freeze the secondary lien pending investigation," Dunn said. "Greer cannot foreclose on a disputed lien, and if the investigation supports the claim—" He paused. "The lien could be voided entirely." Corden looked at the documents on the desk, at his uncle's careful handwriting on the ledger entry, at the corporate structure document that Calder Voss had written out in his stone house because an old man had looked at what was happening to his dead friend's ranch and decided that someone ought to be paying attention. "There is one more thing," Corden said. He told Dunn about Brackett Hale and Denton Voss. He had been thinking about them since the night before, about the pattern Willa had named as a system, about the way Greer's name kept appearing at the edge of other men's difficulties. He had decided, riding back from Calder, to pay them both a visit before Saturday. Dunn looked at him carefully. "You think Greer has done this before?" "I think a man who built something this carefully with my ranch did not build it for the first time with my ranch," Corden said. "That is all I know right now." Dunn nodded slowly. "Talk to them. Come back to me Sunday evening with whatever they tell you. I will spend the weekend working on the filing." He stood and offered his hand. "File Monday morning, all of it." Corden rode to Brackett Hale's place that afternoon. Hale was a broad, quiet man of about 50 who had been working his land in the Copper Ridge Valley for going on 8 years. They knew each other from the cattle auctions, the acquaintance of men who worked near the same problems and nod at each other across livestock pens without much occasion for deeper conversation. Corden did not give a reason for the visit. Said he was in the area and asked how things were going. Hale poured coffee and answered honestly the way men in difficult situations answer when they are not being directly questioned about the difficulty. Things were tight. The herd was not where he wanted it. He had bought from a reliable supplier down in Las Animas County good cattle at a fair price, but the animals had not performed the way he expected. He had a secondary arrangement with a private creditor that had seemed reasonable at the time and was beginning to feel less so. Corden asked who the creditor was. Hale said Aldous Greer. Corden rode to Denton Voss the following morning. Voss was younger, 35 or so, with the look of a man who had been carrying fear for long enough that it was beginning to convert to anger, which was a healthier direction but not a comfortable one. He had been working his land for 4 years. He had a secondary lien with Greer. He had bought cattle from Las Animas County on Greer's recommendation. His herd was half what it had been when he started, and he could not account for why. Cordon rode home through the cold afternoon and sat at the kitchen table and wrote down what both men had told him. Same creditor, same supplier, same pattern of unexplained decline. He spread the notes in front of him and looked at them. Then he heard Willa come in from the north pasture, and he did not wait for her to settle. "Greer has done this with at least 2 other ranches," he said. "Hale and Voss. Same lien, same suppliers, same kind of losses they cannot explain." She stood in the kitchen doorway, with her coat still on, and read his notes from where she stood. 3 properties, she said. 3 secondary liens, 3 referrals to failing cattle sources. She came to the table and sat down. This is not opportunistic. This is a structure. He identifies land he wants, creates the conditions for failure, positions himself as the creditor who will eventually hold the paper when foreclosure comes. She paused. "How long has he been doing this?" "The survey puts it back to at least 81, Cordon said. "Maybe further. Dunn needs to know about Hale and Voss. I am seeing him Sunday." She looked at him across the table. Something in her expression shifted slightly in the way it sometimes did when he surprised her, though she kept those moments brief. "You already planned that?" "You told me to listen," he said. "I listened, and then I thought about what the listening meant." She opened her ledger and began to write. The cattle count by this point had reached 24. The 3 he had separated for individual care had recovered on clean water and better forage, putting on weight that was measurable by hand along their ribs and had been reintegrated into the main herd at the end of the 2nd week. One of the 5 animals recovered from the east boundary had turned out to be carrying a calf, which arrived on a cold Thursday morning without complication and stood up within the hour on legs that were uncertain but determined. Cordon had stood at the pen rail and watched the calf find its footing and thought about Eben, who had started this herd from 6 animals and built it through seasons that were not always kind. 24 animals, not 45, but moving. That evening, Willa was working late at the kitchen table when he came back from the night check. She had the water rights documentation, spread out papers from the tin box that she had found on the first day and set aside for later examination. He poured water and sat down, and she did not look up. "The tin box," she said. "Eben's. I brought it in when I took over. Never went through all of it properly. There is a water rights addendum filed in 1875, she said. 2 years after your uncle purchased the land." She turned the document around so he could read it. "This grants permanent and transferable access to the North Spring and the eastern tributary as primary water sources for the designated grazing acreage. It is filed with the county and attached to the property title." She looked at him. "It cannot be transferred, sold, or legally appropriated without the property owner's explicit written consent." He read the document, read it again. "When you abandoned the North Spring and switched to East Fork Creek," she said, "you did not lose the right. You stopped using it. There is a difference, and the difference matters legally." She put her finger on a specific paragraph. "This addendum specifies that if a primary water source is abandoned without documented cause for more than 5 continuous years, the water rights can revert to county authority." He looked at the paragraph. "You switched to East Fork Creek in the spring of 1882, she said. "That is 3 years, not 5. You still have time." She held his gaze. "If you had followed Crane's advice and continued to neglect the North Spring for 2 more years, Greer could have petitioned the county to revert those water rights. A property without documented primary water rights in this territory is worth significantly less at assessment." She paused. The foreclosure price would drop. His acquisition cost would drop, and he would pocket the difference between what he paid and what the land was actually worth. The kitchen was very still. "He was dismantling this place piece by piece," Cordon said. "Yes. And I was—" His voice went quiet. "I was working myself hollow trying to fix damage that someone was causing underneath me on purpose." She looked at him steadily and did not look away. He stood up, sat back down. put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. The hands that had swung a pickaxe and mended fence and moved cattle and done every physical thing a man could do to keep a piece of land alive. While underneath the work, a patient man with a plan had been loosening the foundations, one quiet decision at a time. The anger was there, cold and specific, but underneath it, something steadier had taken hold. The clarity of a man who has finally seen the full picture of his situation and understands that the picture, however ugly, is better than the fog. "We file Monday," he said. "All of it. Lien challenge and fraud complaint." "Yes." She picked up her pen. "And Sunday you go to Dunn with what Hale and Voss told you. He needs the full scope before he drafts the filings." He was already nodding. Then the night outside the kitchen window made a sound it should not have made. He heard it clearly in the stillness. Not wind, not cattle. Something moving through the cold with a purpose it was trying not to announce. He was up and had his coat and was out the back door in less than half a minute, moving with a care that came from years of working isolated country where sounds that did not belong meant something required a response. The barn door was not the way he had left it. Not open, not obviously disturbed. Just fractionally wrong in a way that only a man who has latched the same door every night for 4 years would notice. He went in hard on the left side, pressing his back to the wall, letting his eyes adjust to the interior dark before he moved, a shape at the far end of the barn near the back wall moving fast and low toward the rear exit. Cordon crossed the barn in 4 strides and hit the back door at a run and came out into the dark yard in time to hear hoofbeats already fading east on the frozen ground, moving at a pace that was deliberate and not panicked. A man who had done this before. A man who had an exit planned. He stood in the cold and listened until the sound was gone. Then he went back into the barn and lit the lantern and held it up to the high shelf at the back wall. Someone had been through the records. Not ransacked, carefully searched. The kind of search that tries to look like it has not happened, that replaces things close to where they were found, but not quite exactly. He could see the difference because he knew exactly how he had left everything. He went back inside. Willa was at the kitchen doorway with her coat on over her nightclothes and her ledger in her hand. "The high shelf in the barn," he said. "Someone went through the records." "The tin box is in my room," she said. "Has been since the second night." She met his eyes. "I moved everything that mattered after I found the water rights addendum. I expected that a man who feels the ground moving would act like it." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "He just told us we are close enough that he is scared." He set down the lamp he had carried in from the barn. "We go to Dunn tomorrow, all of it. And we file Monday before he can do anything else." She looked at him with the expression she wore when he arrived at a conclusion she had already reached. She opened her ledger to a fresh page and wrote the date and a single line of notation. Then she set the ledger down and went back to her room. He stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet. Outside the east boundary, a man on a fast horse was riding back to wherever Aldous Greer had sent him from. He had found nothing. He would report that he had found nothing, and Greer would understand that his window was closing. Good, let him understand. Cordon went to bed. 2 days later, on Saturday morning, Greer filed the injunction. It arrived with Hector Blythe, who handed it over with the expression of a man completing a transaction he had not designed and did not enjoy. Greer was petitioning the county court to remove Willa Pruitt from the assessment contract. The grounds stated were misrepresentation of professional credentials. The claim was that she had presented herself as a licensed agricultural officer to the land office when no such licensing category existed for women in Colorado Territory. The injunction hearing was set for Tuesday before Judge Orrin Falk. Cordon read it once and understood it immediately. Greer was not trying to discredit the work. He was trying to remove the person doing it before the lien challenge could be filed on Monday. If Willa was formally removed from the assessment contract by Tuesday, any findings she had made could be challenged as tainted. The fraud case would take longer to build without her in place. And longer meant more time for a patient man to do what patient men do when they feel the walls moving. "He is not attacking the ranch," Corden said. "He is attacking the evidence by removing the person who found it." "Yes," she said. "Can he succeed?" She was quiet for a moment. "The claim has a technical basis," she said. "There is no licensing body for women in this category in Colorado territory. I presented myself as a consultant, which is what I am and what the contract states, but in a courtroom before a judge, Greer has prior standing with—" She paused. "It is not nothing." Corden folded the injunction. "Ride to Dunn with me this afternoon," he said. "We tell him everything, all of it, and we file Monday morning before Greer can move again." She looked at him. Then she picked up her coat from the hook by the door. "Yes," she said. "Let us go." Monday came the way significant days sometimes come quietly without ceremony, the sky over Copper Ridge flat and gray and giving nothing away. Corden was up before light. He did the morning check on the cattle without rushing, moving through the herd in the cold dark, the way he had done every morning for 4 years, counting and checking and reading the small signals that animals gave when they were well or unwell. 24 animals. The calf was nursing without difficulty, growing into itself with the particular determination of something born onto land that had just begun again to be properly kept. The 3 that had been separated for recovery were indistinguishable now from the rest of the herd in their movement and their weight. He stood in the dark pasture for a moment with his breath making small clouds and listened to the sound of 24 animals on land that belonged to them and to him. And then he went back inside. Willa was already at the table. She had been there for some time by the look of it, the lamp burning low, her notebook open to a page dense with figures. She looked up when he came in. "Dunn files at 9, she said. "I know." He made coffee, set a cup beside her without disturbing the papers, sat down across from her with his own, and looked at the documents stacked at the end of the table. The water rights addendum, the corporate structure paper from Calder, Eben's letter, the ledger with the $340 entry, the notes from his conversations with Hale and Voss. The injunction Greer had filed on Saturday, sitting on top of the stack like a statement of intent. "When Dunn's contact in Pueblo reaches the county clerk," Corden said, "how long before we know if the records are accessible and the name is there?" Dunn said by noon. She turned a page in her notebook. "If it takes longer than that, it means the structure is more buried than Calder's document suggests. And if it is buried too deep to reach by Tuesday," she looked at him, "then we go into the hearing with what we have, which is substantial." She paused. "But Greer's name in those records is the difference between a strong claim and one that cannot be contested." He drank his coffee and looked at the injunction. "He filed on a Saturday," Corden said. "He could have waited until Monday. Filed it the same morning Dunn files the lien challenge. Made it simultaneous, caused maximum confusion." He turned the injunction over in his hand. "He filed Saturday because he found out the barn search got nothing. He felt something slipping and he moved before he was ready." She looked at him. "A patient man who panics makes mistakes." "Yes," he said, "and we are going to be there when those mistakes land." He finished his coffee and went to get his coat. There was work to do before he rode to town, and the work did not pause because the legal machinery was in motion. The north fence needed checking. The grain store needed an accounting. The cattle in the east section needed their morning water confirmed. He did all of it in order with the concentration of a man who has learned that keeping a ranch well is its own form of argument, that the condition of the land speaks as loudly in a courtroom as anything written on paper. By 8 o'clock, he was saddled. Willa came out of the house with her coat on and her ledger under her arm. He had not asked her to come. He simply waited while she mounted the older bay that had been Eben's, and then they rode toward Copper Ridge together in the gray Monday morning, with the mountains behind them and the town ahead. Harwick Dunn filed at 9:15. Corden sat in the small chair beside Dunn's desk and watched the attorney work through the documents with the efficiency of a man who had spent the weekend preparing and was now executing the preparation. 2 filings. The lien challenge first formally contesting the validity of the secondary lien agreement on grounds of misrepresentation and conflict of interest in its commission. The fraud complaint second directed to the county sheriff's office, citing the survey company. The false disbursement, the deliberate misinformation about the North Spring water source, and the pattern of similar conduct identified in connection with the Hale and Voss properties. Dunn sent both by messenger to the county courthouse and the sheriff's office simultaneously. Then he sat back and looked at Corden and Willa. Now we wait for Pueblo. They did not have to wait long. The telegraph came at 11:40. Dunn's contact at the Pueblo County Clerk's office had located the founding documents of the survey company, incorporated in the spring of 1880 and dissolved in November of 1881. The corporate structure listed 3 partners. The silent partner holding 40% of the company's stake, buried beneath a business associate's name in the secondary filing, was listed as Aldous Greer of Copper Ridge, Colorado Territory. Dunn read the telegraph aloud. Then he set it down. Corden looked at the name printed in the sparse shorthand of a county clerk doing his job on a Monday morning in Pueblo without knowing what it meant to the man sitting in a lawyer's office 60 miles north. Aldous Greer, silent partner, 40%. A company built to extract the geological and water rights information from a sick old man who thought he was dealing with a railroad agent and paid $340 for the privilege. There it is, Dunn said. This connects him directly, Willa said, not by inference. Directly. It does, Dunn said. Combined with the corporate dissolution date 6 weeks after Eben Marsh died and 6 weeks after the land passed to Corden, the conclusion is clear. The company had served its purpose. He picked up his pen. I will attach this to the fraud complaint by end of day. The county sheriff will have the full picture before 5 o'clock. Corden said, and the injunction hearing tomorrow. Tomorrow is a different matter, Dunn said. He looked at Willa. The injunction is about your contract, not the fraud. Greer's attorney will argue credentials. I will argue contract language. Judge Falk will decide. He paused. But I want him to walk into that courtroom tomorrow, knowing that a fraud complaint with Greer's name attached to it was filed this morning. That changes the weight of the room. They rode back to the ranch. By the time they reached the access road, word had already begun to move through Copper Ridge the way it always did, faster than feet carried by nothing more than the gravity of the thing itself. Hector Blythe passed them on the road going the other direction and touched his hat in a way that was different from his usual acknowledgement, more deliberate, the nod of a man who knows something has shifted and is deciding how he feels about it. That evening, Brackett Hale rode out to the ranch. He sat at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and told Corden that he had heard about the filing, that he was ready to put his own situation in front of an attorney if it came to it, and that he wanted Corden to know he was not alone in this. Denton Voss sent a written note shorter and more angular in its language, but carrying the same message underneath. He was ready. He had been ready for longer than he had admitted to himself. Corden read both and set them with the other documents. That night he lay awake, but the wakefulness was different from all the other wakeful nights of the past 18 months. He lay in the dark and thought about Tuesday, about Greer's attorney and the arguments they would make, about Judge Orrin Falk, a tall, deliberate man who moved through the world as though everything waited for him, because in his courtroom everything did. About Eben's letter and the weight of it, a man who felt the shape of something wrong and had not lived long enough to see it named. He got up before light and went out to count the cattle. 24, the calf included. He stood in the dark pasture and counted them and felt underneath the anxiety of what the morning held, something that had not been available to him for a very long time. Not certainty. Something more honest than certainty. The knowledge that he had looked at his situation clearly, had refused to look away from what he found in it, had built from what he found a structure that could stand up to examination. Whatever happened in that courtroom, he had done that. Eben had asked for someone who would look clearly and tell the land the truth. He had done that. He went back inside and put his good coat on and made coffee and waited for the morning. Tuesday arrived cold and clear, the sky over Copper Ridge, that hard, deep blue that Colorado produced in winter, like a declaration. Cordon dressed with care. Not in anything he did not own or did not work in, but clean and pressed and deliberate, the presentation of a man who understood that how you carried yourself in a room was part of what you were saying. He and Willa rode to town together again. The silence between them on the road had become, over the course of 10 days, a comfortable thing, the silence of two people who have worked alongside each other long enough that the absence of words is not an absence of communication. He was tying his horse to the post outside the courthouse when Aldous Greer appeared. Not from the courthouse. From the narrow gap between the assayer's office and the land surveyor's building, the approach of a man who had positioned himself to intercept rather than to encounter. He was dressed well, as he always was, the jacket good quality and recently brushed, the boots polished. His face wore the careful arrangement of a person who has decided in advance what expression to use. "Cordon," he said. His voice was measured, almost warm. "I was hoping to speak with you before this goes any further." Cordon looked at him and said nothing. "I want you to know that none of this is personal," Greer said. "I have always believed you are a good man dealt a hard hand. What I offered you was meant to be a lifeline when the land office terms were not sufficient." He paused. The pause was calibrated, a beat of apparent sincerity placed precisely enough that a man off balance might receive it as real. "I also want you to know that your uncle came to me, voluntarily, in the summer of 1881. He said he was sick and frightened, and he wanted the land to go to someone who could do something with it." His voice dropped slightly. "He told me he was not certain you could." The street was quiet around them. A wagon moved past on the main road. Somewhere behind them the courthouse door stood open. Cordon stood very still. He heard the words. He let them arrive and settle. He thought about Calder Voss in his stone house saying, "Your uncle said you would make something of it." He thought about his uncle's letter, the careful handwriting of a man who had been afraid for the land, and had written 6 days before he died that he hoped whoever came after him would be someone who did not give up on it. He thought about the 2 years he had carried the weight of believing Ben had been wrong to trust him. The mornings he had counted the cattle and added the numbers to the verdict against himself. All that weight, and here was the man who had manufactured it, offering it to him one last time as a gift dressed up as honesty. He looked at Aldous Greer directly, and without anger, the look of a man stating something plain. "My uncle wrote a letter 6 days before he died," he said. "He gave it to Calder Voss. I read it 2 days ago." He paused. He did not doubt me. He did not want to sell. He felt the shape of something being arranged around him while he was sick, and he wrote it down, and this morning a judge is going to read it. Greer's composed expression did not collapse. It simply became something else, the arrangement of a man whose calculation has returned an unexpected result, and who is processing the distance between where he thought he was and where he actually is. Cordon turned and walked into the courthouse. The courtroom was not large. Copper Ridge was a county seat, but a modest one, and its courthouse reflected the practical priorities of a community that needed the function more than the form. Judge Orrin Falk's bench was solid oak, dark with age. The gallery benches held perhaps 30 people, and most of them were occupied, because word had moved through the town, and the people of Copper Ridge had opinions about Aldous Greer that they had been keeping to themselves for varying amounts of time. Cordon sat at the plaintiff's table with Harwick Dunn. Willa sat beside Dunn with her ledger closed on the table in front of her, her hands folded on top of it, her posture, the stillness of a person who has prepared thoroughly and is now simply present and waiting. Greer sat at the opposing table with an attorney named Caldwell Price, who had come from Denver and whose suit cost more than most men in the room earned in a month. Price had the manner of a man accustomed to being the most credentialed person in any room he entered, which in this room was probably accurate, and which Cordon suspected would not help him as much as he expected. Judge Falk entered, and the room stood and sat again. Falk read the injunction filing, read Dunn's response, read the assessment contract between Willa and the Copper Ridge Land Office. He read each document at his own pace without commentary, his face giving nothing away, the deliberateness of a man who understood that the reading itself was a statement. Then he looked at Price. The filing claims Miss Pruitt represented herself as a licensed agricultural officer, Falk said. The contract in evidence describes her engagement as a consultant. These are not the same thing. He set the contract down. How does your client reconcile that discrepancy? Price was good. He pivoted with the fluency of a man accustomed to pivoting, arguing that the practical function Willa had performed constituted the operational equivalent of a licensed officer, regardless of the contract language that the land office had been materially misled as to the nature of her professional standing, that the findings she had produced could not be considered reliable assessments under the term of the operating agreement. He spoke for 8 minutes with precision and confidence. Then Dunn stood up. He did not match Price's rhetorical fluency, and he did not try to. He simply read the assessment contract, the specific language of the consultant engagement, the absence of any licensing requirement for that category in Colorado territory as of 1883. He read the preliminary assessment report, not all of it, the key findings, the water source analysis, the cattle recovery, the pasture rotation implementation, the weight gain data, measured and recorded over 10 days. He read the figures with the flat patience of a man who trusts numbers to speak for themselves when given adequate room. Then he submitted the sworn statements from Brackett Hale and Denton Voss, both attesting to the professional quality and accuracy of the work Willa Pruitt had conducted on the Marsh property. Price objected to their relevance. Falk said he would determine relevance and read them anyway. When he finished reading, he looked up. Not at Price. Not at Dunn. He looked at Greer directly for the first time since the proceedings had begun, with the gaze of a man who has read the room and the documents and has arrived at a position. "Mr. Greer," he said, "are you aware that a fraud complaint was filed with the county sheriff's office yesterday morning, arising from circumstances directly connected to the secondary lien you hold on the Marsh property?" The room was very still. Price leaned toward Greer. A whispered exchange. Greer straightened. "I have been made aware," he said carefully. "Then you understand." Falk said that this court views any attempt to interfere with an ongoing lawful assessment process, particularly one that may produce evidence relevant to a separate criminal complaint, as a matter of serious concern. He set the filings down with the finality of a man who has made a decision and is now putting it into effect. Injunction denied. Miss Pruitt will continue in her contracted capacity. Court costs to the filing party. He looked at Price. Advise your client to cooperate fully with the sheriff's office inquiry. Today. Greer stood. He walked out of the courtroom without looking at anyone, Price beside him, the gallery watching them go in the silence of a community that has been holding its breath about something for longer than it realized. Corden sat still after the room began to empty. Dunn gathered his papers beside him. Willa opened her ledger to a fresh page and wrote the date, the ruling the case number. He watched her hand move across the page and almost smiled. "The corporate records from Pueblo," Corden said. "That was what changed the weight of the room. The contract language would have been sufficient to deny the injunction," Dunn said. "Falk is a careful man, and the language was clean, but the fraud complaint with Greer's name in the founding documents." He closed his briefcase. That changed what the injunction meant. It became an attempt to obstruct evidence in a fraud investigation. Falk understood that without being told. Corden nodded. "The lien challenge will take 6 weeks to work through the court," Dunn said. "The fraud complaint longer, but the lien is frozen. Greer cannot foreclose. He cannot transfer the paper. He cannot do anything with it while the challenge is pending." He looked at Corden. "You have time. Use it well." They rode back to the ranch in the early afternoon. The weeks that followed had a different quality from everything that had come before. The work was the same work, the physical labor of a ranch coming back from a long diminishment, the daily attention to animals and land and water and fence line. But the weight of it had changed. The pressure that had been present in every hour of the past 18 months, the pressure of a man working against a deadline he could feel but not see, had lifted. not disappeared. Changed. Become the manageable weight of a man working towards something rather than away from it. In late March, Corden rode to the Pueblo Stockyard Fair and purchased 3 animals. Good bloodlines, properly assessed from a supplier Willer had researched before he spent $1 on them. He brought them back and integrated them into the herd. The count reached 27 then, with the continued health of the calf and the sustained recovery of the earlier animals, 29 by mid-April. The lean challenge was heard in county court on a Tuesday in that same month. Dunn presented the case in full. The Pueblo Incorporation records were entered into evidence. Calder Voss gave a sworn statement about the July 1881 meeting, the false railroad agent, the disbursement Eben had signed, the survey results that never came, and his own investigation afterward into the company's structure and dissolution. He was present in the courtroom, sitting in the gallery in his best coat, the sharp eyes of a man who has waited a long time to see something put right. Rufus Crane's telegraph from Raton, New Mexico, was entered into evidence. The full text of it in Crane's own blunt shorthand, that he had been directed by Greer's foreman to tell Corden the North Spring was running dry, that he had done it because he needed the work, that he was sorry for it, that he would testify in person if required. Brackett, Hale, and Denton Voss gave testimony about their own secondary lien agreements and the suppliers Greer had recommended, and about the pattern of losses they had experienced that they could not account for through any failure of their own work. And then Dunn read Eben's letter. He read it aloud in a courtroom where half of Copper Ridge was sitting, some of whom had known Eben Marsh for 20 years, and who listened to the quiet words of a sick old man describing the shape of something wrong, with the attention of people hearing a thing confirmed that they had half suspected and never been able to name. The letter filled the courtroom in the way that plain truth fills a room when it has been kept out of it for a long time. Not loud, not dramatic. Just present and unmistakable, and without any available counter-argument. When Dunn finished reading, the courtroom was very quiet. The presiding judge, a circuit judge named Alderman, who came through Copper Ridge 4 times a year and who knew the county's history better than most people who lived in it, looked at the lien agreement and the corporate records and the sworn statements and the letter for a long time. Then he voided the lien, fully and completely, on the grounds that the secondary lien agreement had been entered into by a party who had obtained material private information about the secured property through fraud and who had used that information to structure an agreement designed to result in the acquisition of said property at below market value through the manufactured failure of the borrower's operation. The courtroom exhaled. Not an eruption. A release, the collective sound of a community that had been holding its breath about something and had finally heard it named and resolved in plain language by a person with the authority to resolve it. Corden sat at the plaintiff's table and looked at the judge's written order and read it twice. Harwick Dunn shook his hand. Willa, sitting beside Dunn, wrote something in her ledger. He looked at what she wrote, the date, the ruling, the case number. He looked at her face, at the expression she wore when she had done what she set out to do, which was not quite satisfaction and not quite relief, and was possibly something that did not have a name that fitted exactly, and he understood. The fraud complaint moved more slowly, as criminal matters do. But it moved. Rufus Crane, faced with a deputy sheriff who arrived in Raton with a formal request, and the telegraph Crane himself had sent, made the practical decision that cooperation served him better than its alternative. He provided a detailed account. 4 properties over 5 years. A structure built with the patience of a man who believed no one was paying close enough attention to see what he was building. Greer engaged additional attorneys from Denver and filed several motions that extended the criminal proceedings through the summer. But the motions delayed, they did not stop, and the difference mattered more than Greer's attorneys had perhaps told him it would. In October, facing a trial in which the Pueblo Incorporation records and Crane's account and Eben's letter and the statements of 3 separate ranchers would be presented to a jury from Copper Ridge County. Greer reached an agreement with the county prosecutor. He surrendered his property interests in the Marsh Ranch, the Hale property, and the Voss operation. He paid restitution. He agreed to leave Copper Ridge County by the end of November and not to engage in property lending or acquisition in Colorado Territory for a period of 10 years. He was gone before the month was out. Nobody marked the departure, Hector Blythe mentioned it to Corden in passing the way you mention a change in weather. Said Greer's house on the east side of town had been shuttered since Tuesday. Corden said he had heard something of it and went back to what he was doing. Brackett Hale and Denton Voss both engaged Dunn for their own lean challenges. Both prevailed. The proceedings were shorter, benefiting from the groundwork already laid, the Pueblo records already in the county's possession, Crane's account already on file. Hale told Corden afterward that sitting in the courtroom while the lien was voided felt like something being returned to the position it should have been in all along. Corden said he understood exactly what that felt like. By the time the first snow came down off the mountains in November, the herd at the Marsh Ranch stood at 31 animals. 24 of them had survived the long diminishment of the Greer years. 7 were new purchased over the summer from sources Willer had vetted before Corden paid for a single one good bloodlines that performed exactly as their constitution suggested they would on properly managed grass and clean water from a spring that had been running clear since March. In September, Calder Voss came to the ranch for dinner. He rode out on a Sunday evening and tied his horse to the post and came into the kitchen without knocking, in the way of old men who have been coming to a place long enough that the formality has worn off. He sat at the table where Corden had spread so many documents over so many late nights, the same table where Willer had worked by lamplight, while the ranch was still in danger and everything was still uncertain. He looked around the kitchen with the slow attention of someone taking the measure of a place they care about. Willer made coffee. Corden put food on the table, a plain sufficient meal, the kind a working ranch produced without ceremony. They ate without rush. Calder talked about Eben for a while. Stories from the early years, the 6 cattle and the hard first winters, the particular stubbornness of a man who had decided this was his land and had simply refused to let it tell him otherwise. Corden listened and ate and felt his uncle's presence in the stories, the way you feel the presence of someone who shaped the rooms you live in, not as grief anymore, but as something more habitable. Something you could carry without it weighing you down. After a while, Calder set down his fork and looked around the kitchen once more slowly and then looked at Corden with the eyes of a man whose private assessment of something has just been confirmed. "Eben would have been proud of what you did, son," he said. "Not just the land, the way you did it. The way you looked at what was happening instead of looking away from it." Corden was quiet for a moment. He looked across the table. Willa was writing in her notebook, as she often was in the evenings, the small, precise movements of a woman recording what the day had produced. She had been writing things down since the first morning she arrived, and she had not stopped, and the accumulated record of what she had written over the course of the year was now referenced in 3 separate county legal proceedings and had been cited in an agricultural bulletin of the Colorado Territorial Extension Office in a piece about grazing rotation practices on high-altitude rangeland. She was listed as the author, Willa Pruitt, agricultural consultant. "He would have liked her too," Corden said. Calder looked at Willa and then back at Corden and made the quiet sound of a man who did not need to say anything more about it. He picked up his coffee cup and looked out the kitchen window at the dark land where the cattle were settled in the north pasture on grass that was measurably better than it had been in March on a rotation schedule that had been designed to let the land tell you what it needed instead of taking from it until there was nothing left to take. After dinner, Calder rode back toward his stone house east of town, and Corden stood in the yard and watched him go. The October night had come down off the mountains, and the air had the edge it got in fall cold and clean and carrying the smell of the high country. The north pasture was dark and quiet, 31 animals settling for the night. He heard the kitchen door behind him. Willa came out and stood beside him in the dark. She had her coat on. She looked out at the pasture and the mountains beyond it and said nothing for a while, which was one of the things he had come to understand about her over the course of 9 months. Her silences were not absences. They were a form of presence. She had been here since March. The contract from the land office had specified 3 months. At the end of 3 months, Hendricks, the regional supervisor, had written to confirm the operating loan restructured at terms that reflected the documented improvement of the property and its trajectory. He had described the Marsh Ranch in his regional report as a model recovery case. The contract had ended. Willa had not left. They had not discussed it formally. There had been no renegotiation of terms, no new document, no conversation in which the arrangement was named. She had simply continued to work, and he had continued to work beside her, and the months had accumulated, and the land had responded in the way land responds when it is told the truth. Not immediately, not dramatically, but with something real that built on itself. She stood beside him now in the October dark and looked out at the land. "The north section's soil samples from last week," she said. "The root density has improved 40% from the baseline measurements I took in March." "I know. You showed me. I want to document it formally for the Extension Office follow-up report." "I know that too." She was quiet again. A long, easy quiet. "You could have sent for the land office to assign a different contractor after the injunction," he said. "Would have been simpler." "Simpler is not the same as better," she said. "No, it is not." He looked at her in the dark. At the stillness she carried, which he had come to understand was not coldness, but concentration. The demeanor of a woman who had learned early that the world required her to be twice as precise and half as visible as the men around her, and who had decided that the precision was worth having, even if she would rather not have needed it. She had ridden onto this land 9 months ago and looked at a failing ranch and refused to look away from what she found in it. She had found things he had not known were there to find. She had built a case from documents in a tin box and a ledger he had stopped opening, and the memory of an old man in a stone house and a telegraph from a man in New Mexico who was sorry he had needed the work. And she was standing in the yard of this ranch on an October night as though she was exactly where she had chosen to be. "Stay," he said. One word, no argument attached to it. No arrangement proposed, no terms offered, no structure suggested beyond the word itself, said plainly in the Colorado dark by a man who had learned in the past 9 months that the most important things could be stated simply if you were willing to state them without dressing them in anything else. She looked at him. He looked back and waited. She had spent her life moving. He understood that about her, understood it the way you understand the things people show you through their actions before they name them in words. Her father's farm lost when she was 19, and after that, the movement, the ledger, and the boots, and the work, county to county, ranch to ranch, arriving at failing operations and telling people hard truths and leaving before the truths fully settled. Moving because she had promised herself she would never be the thing her father was, a man who knew better and stood still. She had kept that promise well. He was not asking her to break it. He was asking her to consider whether the moving had been the point or only the means to something else. Whether what she had been moving toward was possibly a place that had earned her presence rather than a refusal to stay in any place that had not. She looked out at the pasture, at the dark land carrying more life in its soil than it had when she arrived, its root systems recovering towards something that resembled what Eben Marsh had built here decades ago before anyone started quietly taking it apart. She put her hand on his arm, not with ceremony, not with declaration. The simple, deliberate contact of a woman making a choice with her hands before she makes it in words, which was how she made all her most important decisions, through evidence and action rather than assertion. He put his hand over hers. They stood like that in the yard of the Marsh Ranch in the October dark, for a while not saying anything further, while the cattle moved quietly in the north pasture, and the mountains stood at the edge of the sky where they had always stood, and the land breathed around them with the quality of something that has been through a long difficulty and has come out the other side of it not unchanged, but intact. The following spring, Willa submitted a formal guide on her own behalf to the Colorado Territorial Agricultural Board, a standardized methodology for assessing and recovering struggling ranch operations across the territory. Harwick Dunn helped her with the filing language. The board published it in April. She was listed as the author. Willa Pruitt, agricultural consultant, Copper Ridge, Colorado Territory. Corden read it at the kitchen table on a morning in May, the same table where she had worked through so many nights, with the lamp burning low and the Colorado dark outside and the whole uncertain weight of what they were building pressing on every hour. He read it and set it down. Then he went out to check the cattle. 34 now with the additions from the spring purchases, good bloodlines assessed and verified before he spent $1. Animals that had settled into the land as though they had always belonged on it, which in the way that mattered most, they had. He counted them in the morning light and wrote the number in the ledger in his own handwriting, the same ledger that had once held a column of numbers circled 3 times and a payment in a dead man's hand that had started the unraveling of a careful and patient fraud. He wrote the number. He closed the ledger. He walked back to the house where the coffee was on and the day was beginning and the land outside every window was his properly. His held without debt and without the shadow of a man waiting patiently at its edge. Cordon Marsh had been handed a dying ranch and 4 years of compounding failure and a letter from a government office that said prove it is worth saving or lose it. He had counted 14 cattle on a cold March morning and believed in the part of himself he did not show to anyone that the counting was already a kind of farewell. He had been wrong about that. The ranch was not dying. It had never been dying. It had been in the hands of a man who did not know what was being done to it, working against a diminishment that had been carefully manufactured by someone who understood that the most effective trap is the one the person inside it believes they built for themselves. Cordon knew the difference now. He would always know the difference. And the land, which did not know about lien agreements or fraud complaints or county courtrooms, which only knew about water and grass and the quality of care it received from the people responsible for it, was already answering in the only language it had. 34 cattle on good grass drinking from a clean spring that had run clear and cold through every season anyone could remember on land that a man named Eben Marsh had built from nothing and promised to someone he believed in. That promise had held.